Good morning, everyone. You have reached Michelle with Reflect Live Podcast, and I have EJ Hammon with me. How are you doing this morning?
Good, doing well. Thank you. It's a nice
Good.
sunny day here in North Carolina.
Oh, I bet. And
Yeah.
we're having great weather here as well. I am
Awesome.
going live on Instagram. So there we got that going live. All right. We are good to go.
All
Let
right.
me make sure that we are live on Facebook and we are good. All right. So it's been a while since we've spoke.
That's right. Yeah. A few
Yeah.
months. Yeah.
A few months. Yeah. So how have you been doing?
Good. Been busy.
Yeah.
Got a lot of projects running right now. So yeah, just pretty busy right now.
Oh, that's awesome. We'll get into those projects, but I am super excited to talk about your book.
Yeah.
You're co-author of that book. So we
Yes.
have Ted Bundy, Memory of the Beast, and so let's just dive right into it. How did you get involved with that book, and tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. I have been friends with one of Ted Bundy's survivors, Kathy Kleiner, for a while. And I actually interviewed her for my blog, which is bundyphile.com, bundyphile.com. And so I interviewed her for that. And then she had been talking with who is now my co-author, Fabian Richard. He is in France. And he had been working with her on her story for the book as part of the idea was to have a collection of stories about surviving Ted Bundy, the people that were involved in the case. He'd been talking to her for a while, and he advised her, well, I'd really like to work with an American author on this story. And of course, she knew me, and so she suggested me to Fabian, and we talked, and it seemed like a really good fit. So the idea behind the book was that we wanted our subjects to choose a photo from that time in their life when they were somehow touched by Ted Bundy, and to describe what that photo meant to them. For example, we had one of the attorneys that prosecuted Ted in the first trial, which was for the Chi Omega murders and the Dunwoody Street attack in Tallahassee. So this was his first Florida trial. And I talked to the attorney, and he chose a photo that was of the bite mark that was left behind on one of the two sorority sisters who died. And he said he knew that bite mark was different. It was a very compelling piece of evidence, because in the 1970s, bite mark evidence was looked at as much less controversial than it is now. But it was unique in that it was a double bite mark, so that the killer had bitten her and then removed his mouth from her body and then bit her again. And so we were really looking for stories that explained that experience of how people were touched by Bundy. In Kathy's case, it was she survived him. She was attacked in the sorority house and she managed to live. So we had a bunch of different ideas for who we wanted to be involved in the book. And we had, I believe, 16 subjects that agreed to be part of it. So we're very lucky.
So for those that don't know who Ted Bundy is, can you tell us a little bit about the background of Ted Bundy, and then some of the things that he did to his victims?
Definitely. Ted Bundy was born in 1946 actually in Vermont, but he lived and grew up in Washington State. Ted Bundy was a serial killer. He is believed to have possibly started killing as early as age 14, although there's no verification of that, no evidence to connect him directly to a specific victim. Then he began killing in his 20s. He liked to try and lure women away from a large crowd, and he would attack them with a tire iron to knock them out. Drive them to another area that was secluded, a lot of times outside, where he would either rape them while they were alive or commit necrophilia on their body. He didn't care whether they were alive or not when he was committing a sexual assault. And then he enjoyed murdering women. We don't know of any male victims. So he was just somebody who looked very normal. Ted Bundy looked like your average college student or college professor. And so
he was very handsome, wasn't he?
I wouldn't say handsome. I think some people thought he was attractive, and I
Mm-hmm.
think his personality can be engaging.
Okay.
So yeah, but he just looked normal,
Okay.
and that was a big attraction, I think,
Yeah.
for me.
When I was reading your book, it was talking about how he would fake to have a broken arm or have broken something to lure the girls.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Bundy relied on the kindness of these young women that he wanted to murder. He assumed and he learned correctly that if he seemed to be incapacitated, for example, if he had a cast on his arm, then they would want to, or they would be more amenable to helping him carry books that he would drop in front of them. And some women were quick to realize it was fraudulent, and they ran away. But a lot of young women, especially during the 70s, when women were taught to be helpful and kind, and unfortunately his ruse really did work on a lot of women. They think there were probably over 30 women that he killed, if not more.
Yeah. Can you tell us some instances about the women that you interviewed and how they got away?
Absolutely. The two survivors that we interviewed were both attacked. They were roommates in the sorority house on Florida State campus. That's in Tallahassee. And they were sleeping. It was approximately 2:45 in the morning on January 15th, 1978. And two of their sorority sisters had already been killed by Ted. So they were the third room that he went into, and they were both asleep. He had taken a piece of firewood from outside of the house that had been cut to use for the sorority house, and he was bludgeoning them, attacking both of these young women in their bed. He would attack one and then turn to attack the other because their beds were right next to each other. And the only reason that they survived was because his attack was stopped. There was a car that pulled up behind the sorority house, which is where their room was, and the lights from the car flooded the room, and he thought he'd been seen by either the person driving or one of the young women, and he ran away and went and attacked someone else because he wasn't finished killing. So when I talked to Kathy Kleiner, she suffered a great deal of damage to her jaw. In particular, she said her jaw was all but hanging from her face. That's how hard he hit them. And she experienced a lot of problems with her jaw. She's recently even had surgery on it, to this day. She has a very unique story in that she's actually strengthened by talking about it. She feels like a much stronger person when she can share her experience. And she actually gave a lecture at CrimeCon last year in Orlando about her experience. And then her roommate, Karen, was also brutally attacked. And she does not feel as comfortable talking about it, but I think she received a whole lot of support, emotional support from the sorority sisters after. So she was able to reclaim her life. And it's just a very different way than Kathy did. And both of the women are doing very well. They seem to be living very successful lives now.
Wow. Yeah. When the part that I read was when the girls always like checked up on each other, and they heard noise, in the room next door, because the book was saying that the walls were really thin, and then the groaning stopped. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. This was the attack that occurred after the Chi Omega murder attack. So just a few minutes. In fact, I've actually walked the distance between the sorority house and the house on Dunwoody Street, which is what you're talking about. And it's maybe half a mile. So, and remember, Ted was very athletic, so he could very easily move very quickly. What you're talking about is the chapter by Debbie Ciccarelli, and she was the next door neighbor of the young woman being attacked. They were good friends. And she and her roommate, Debbie, and her roommate, Nancy, lived on one side of the duplex. And then Cheryl lived on the other side of the duplex. Well, one night, Debbie was woken from her sleep by some unusual sound on the other side of the wall. And she woke her roommate up and said, look, there's something wrong over there. I'm not sure what's happening. So they had a rule between them on either side of the duplex. If we think something's going on, we're going to call you. We think something's wrong. If you don't answer, then we're going to call the police or find another way to get you. And when I spoke with Debbie, I said, is the reason they called the police, and the police immediately came to the house. And the young women that were living next door to Cheryl pretty much stayed in their apartment. But they said the police were there within 4 minutes, maybe. What they didn't know was that the police were already at the Chi Omega house half a mile away. And that's why they got there so fast. They actually dispatched a couple of officers over immediately. And what happened, Bundy broke into this young woman's apartment, attacked her, and he was interrupted by the phone.
Mm-hmm.
And they heard him actually leaving the apartment through the back window. When they heard something like a table turning over, he'd actually gotten on the table to get through the window, and the table fell over.
Yeah.
So the young woman that called the police actually saved her life, saved her friend's life. And it's a fascinating story. I was very lucky to reach out to her. In fact, she told me no one had ever asked her for an interview for a book before.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And I found it fascinating, going back to when he was a boy, and because I'm always intrigued on how people turn like this, right? So like, is it their upbringing? Is it their parenting? Is it chemical imbalance in their brain? Do you know anything more about Bundy's childhood, or was he abused, when he was a child?
The story of Bundy is that he was an unwanted child from an unwed mother. His mother had him in 1946. She did not have a husband, and she had him out of state. So her family was in Philadelphia, but she was sent to an unwed mother's home in Burlington, Vermont, and had the baby, and she went home. And generally what would happen is the children would get adopted out. Well, Ted wasn't adopted, and his mother's father, so his grandfather, insisted that she go and get him and bring him. So he had lived there for 3 months without her, connection to her. So he missed out on that part of life. By the time she brought him home, and this might have been why she didn't really want to bring him home, her father was extremely abusive, violent with family pets, with neighborhood animals, with his own wife. In fact, his wife was so depressed that she had electric shock syndrome, electric shock therapy. And so, there are a lot of stories about his grandfather, and Ted was already showing signs of violence by age 3. So his aunt lived with them, so his mother's sister, and she woke up from a nap one day surrounded by knives. And here he is placing the knives next to her on the bed.
Wow.
And so it was almost as if when his mother moved him away at age 4 to Washington State, so from Philadelphia to Washington, it was something had already taken hold in him, I think. And he grew up feeling very entitled in a family that didn't have a lot of money. So he, resented his parents, felt like they weren't wealthy enough. Which I think you see in a lot of psychopaths, narcissists, that kind of personality, of which he was later diagnosed. So I think that his grandfather had a lot to do with his violence later, because he taught him how to treat women, essentially.
Sure.
So I think that was a lot of it. And there's probably a genetic component. It's hard to say at this time.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, when he was 13, 14, I think maybe even younger than that, where he was a peeping Tom, like he always looked in. Yeah. And then that little girl ended up missing or whatever, and the police were there, and he was like standing at the street corner, watching everything happen.
It's hard to say about that. When Ted was 14, an 8-year-old girl from his neighborhood went missing. They've never found her body. She's still missing. And he lived maybe 5 blocks from her. I've also noted that she was a student of his uncle, his great uncle. So she took piano lessons from him. So Ted probably saw her in the neighborhood, knew who she was. If not being involved in the crime, he definitely, knew what was happening. And it could have, if he wasn't involved, it could have shaped how he later committed his crimes, being that close to something like that. Because it was a huge ordeal in Tacoma, Washington at the time in 1961. So there are theories that he committed the crime. And what you're thinking of is when the young girl's father believed that he saw Bundy standing on a corner. I think it was near like a college where they were building and putting down concrete, and theorized that he had buried her body under something that was later had concrete poured on it.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's hard to say whether or not that's true. Eyewitness testimony, eyewitness accounts being so unreliable, it's hard to know.
Yeah. And then he got involved in a church.
The Mormon church. So when Ted moved to Salt Lake City, Utah in 1974 to go to law school, he found himself surrounded. Of course, Salt Lake City, there were a lot of LDS members there. And so there were some young women that went and talked to Bundy, and, he invited him to come to some meetings for the Mormon faith. And he kind of got involved with that, and he eventually converted. He really did go through and do the conversion. Of course, he had no intention of following any of the restrictions.
Right.
And in fact, once he was convicted of kidnapping of a young woman in 1975, he was convicted of that. He was actually removed from their roster. Later, it's interesting. Later, they baptized him in absentia in 2008.
Wow.
I don't know if you're familiar. The Mormon Church will do that with some people, and a lot of times it's celebrities. And they tried to expunge that from their records, but you can still find a record of where they did that in 2000.
Right? Yeah. And the book, I remember reading, when he was convicted, that one of the Mormons it said that he was having a hard time believing that Bundy would do that, because he was around him for a long time, and just his character, it was hard for him to believe that.
Absolutely. You're thinking of Larry Anderson. He was one of the heads of the parish, I believe, the area church. And he really got to know Ted, but it really shows you how very much a psychopath can appear to be so normal and put on this facade and act, mimic emotions. But and Ted was very skilled at that. So it really speaks to how he's seen by the community, and the fact that he always portrayed himself to be someone, with good ethics, and someone who's reliable and a good friend. And of course, he was none of those things.
Right. And then he would go from state to state, like he would murder somebody and then take their body to another state, because they never talked to each other.
Sometimes.
Yeah,
sometimes he would. Yeah. He had actually worked for a crime prevention group in Seattle in around 1972, where he kind of learned the ins and outs of the police and how they didn't talk, and how, their limitations in solving crimes. So he did from time to time take a victim from one state, for example, from Oregon, and transport her to Washington State. And then, it made it a lot harder for police to connect the crimes. I mean, he had that advantage. Now we have cameras and things that make it very difficult to commit those crimes, but he was right in his element.
Yeah. Isn't that crazy? What inspired you to become a writer?
I have always had a great love of reading from a very young age. And I think I knew about the time I was 13 that I wanted to be a writer. It's just, I felt like I wanted to not just, ingest what people were writing. I wanted to also create it. And so that was really kind of an easy decision. I think I had some question about my ability for a long time. But yeah, once I got over that and really started my blog in 2009 and really started picking up how often I wrote, I felt much more confident.
Oh, wow. What motivated you to write this particular book?
In this case, when I talked with Fabian, he already had an idea of what he wanted the book to be and how he wanted it to look. So it was rather easy to kind of work with him and build the concept together based on his original concept. And the idea of actually talking to other people, not telling Ted's story, telling other people's story, telling the story of the victims and the attorneys and the journalists that talked to him. And it actually was a nice change. And I feel like that's part of what makes our book so unique, is it's not the same old retelling of Ted and talking about him. We're reframing that narrative so that it actually discusses a lot of the other aspects of the crime.
That's why I enjoyed it. It's the other side of the
Yes.
story and what happened. I think that's so cool. Now, are your books or film, and we'll get into your film, are they always have the narrative of like horror, or what's the genre that you're comfortable in?
The genre I'm most comfortable writing in is true crime.
Okay.
There's something to not just telling a nonfiction story, but also just being able to do that kind of research. I really love learning about forensics. I love learning different topics related to crime, different stories. I'm not only interested in Ted. There are a lot of different serial killers and con men and assassins that fascinate me.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really just a broad swath of that particular genre that I enjoy writing about.
Is there anything that happened to you when you were a young girl that made you go and liking this genre?
No, nothing when I was a child. As I got older, seeing the way that people could manipulate other people, that psychology, I think, is really what drew me into crime and true crime in specific.
Neat. That's great.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through like your process of how you write and come up with ideas?
Sure. A lot of times what I'll do is try and find something that hasn't been discussed, specifically in the Bundy story, because I so enjoy writing about him. It's nice to cover some of the angles that haven't been covered in the past. So I recently reached out to one of the suspects in the Chi Omega crimes that Bundy was actually committed. And I reached out to him because I'd never heard his story beyond a couple paragraphs in one book. And it was really interesting because all I had to do was explain what I was doing, and he was interested. And so he allowed me to interview him and write out the article. Once I'd interviewed him, then of course I'm taking copious notes while I'm doing that, even though there was a recording made, but I also really feel confident in once I write it out. Then I have to decide which part of the story I'm going to write about first. Sometimes you start in the middle, you know. It's whatever I can usually get out easily enough without having to do a whole lot of research. And then I'll go in and do the research that I need to back up what someone may be telling me. And then after that, you have to arrange some of the pieces of the story. So I might write the middle of the story at the very top of my piece of paper. And then I have to kind of figure out how I'm going to put it into the story, build it essentially, kind of put the puzzle pieces together. And then once I've done that, I try and refine some of the writing. And generally with my interview subjects, I will offer to have them read it first. And in this case with Ron Eng, that's the suspect's name, I had him read over it, make sure everything was right, make sure the facts made sense, made sure I didn't get something wrong in, you know, a place name or something. And so, yeah, when I interviewed Ron Eng, he was the houseboy, which is more like a handyman that worked at the sorority house. And he was a college student. He was studying music and just like making some extra money working as a handyman at the sorority house. Well, on the night of the attacks, one of the sorority sisters actually saw the suspect leaving the scene of the crime. And she initially thought it was Ron. She thought it was this individual because it was dark and it was like maybe she saw the side view of him, but it looked familiar enough that that's what she said. And he actually had a very strong alibi. I found that interesting, and police still just raked him over the coals. They didn't Mirandize him when he was brought in for questioning. He didn't, he's a 20-year-old student. He didn't know that he could ask for an attorney. And so being able to interview him and discuss what that period of time was like. And now I've got an article published on my blog about his side of the story, which is nice to get all these little details. He's not someone that people generally think about in the Ted story. And he was very easy to interview. He was very open, and, it was a good experience, I think, for both of us.
Wow. I bet. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have about 5 minutes left. Excuse me. What do you have going on now?
Right now, I'm actually looking at putting together a Ted Bundy documentary. Okay. And this is going to be based on a specific period of his life where I'm actually not going to give away all of it, but this is a period where he was very mobile. He was moving around a lot. And so we're looking at, I'm looking at following in his footsteps, following the way that he traveled, using the different types of travel that he used at the time, as close as I can get to 1970s.
Yes.
And yeah, and actually working in collaboration with an experienced filmmaker. So he'll be doing the filming, and I'll be doing, like the scout locations and telling the story and doing the interviews with the people who were there or who knew something about the story. And we're actually going to look at turning that into a book as well. So I'll be working with that same filmmaker on putting that book together. I'm probably most excited about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I just finished filming in Indiana a movie. It's a movie short, and it's called Honor Before Death. It's actually a fictional story, which is different for me, that I co-wrote and directed with the same person I'm working on the documentary with. And we actually just finished filming it last month. So that was really exciting. Just hopefully we'll have that out in the next few months once the editing is finished and we have a finished product to work with.
What's that about? Can you give us a little sneak peek on what that's about?
That is a conversation between two assassins. One, they used to work together, and now it's come to the day of reckoning for one of them. And so they have this conversation, and then you actually get to kind of see how it ends.
Wow.
Yeah, we tried to make that very dramatic, but it's actually just a very short film. I'm very excited though. It was my first attempt at directing, and it actually went really well. So I'm excited about that.
That's exciting. Are you wanting to get into film?
I actually am. I worked recently on another film that I had co-written the screenplay for about Derek Todd Lee. And so that was a much larger film experience, and, working, running as script supervisor and kind of being a catch-all person, doing some scene dressing. And so it was kind of exciting. I kind of got excited about it. And then I decided to write this other shorter movie, and it was a great experience. So yeah, I'm sure I'll be doing more in the filmmaking world.
Nice.
Yeah.
And go ahead and tell what your blog again.
Oh yeah, the name of my blog is bundyphile.com, BUNDYPHILE.com.
And then on your films, and how can people find you and watch your films?
Sure. There's actually a media section on my blog that you can look up everything that I've done. Podcasts I've been interviewed for, podcasts I've written scripts for, and then of course the movies that I've worked on once I have something to link to them.
Nice. Perfect.
Yeah.
Awesome. Is there anything else that you want to talk about before we end?
I really just want to stress the importance to, when we learn about crime, it's very important to always remember the victims, the people who have been, extinguished from this world because a selfish person decided they were going to take their lives, and the survivors as well. You have to consider what they have to go through on a daily basis, the trauma that they experience, the way the world looks so different from them. Some of them become very afraid of certain types of people and certain types of places, and kind of, overcoming that psychologically is very difficult for them. And when we make jokes about serial killers or we denigrate the victims, you're just adding to the trauma that they or their family have experienced.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
So we have 2 minutes left. I always ask my guests to leave with words of wisdom. So do you have any words of wisdom for our listeners?
I would say if you are looking to get involved in a career that you're not really confident that you can get involved in, I would say go ahead and do it. It's something where I hesitated to hone my writing skill for a long time, and I really regret the time that I lost. So get involved as soon as you can. And I feel like even if you fail, you're succeeding. So just do it.
That's good. That's great advice.
Thank you.
Well, EJ, it was so nice, and thank you for coming on the show. We really appreciate it.
I'm talking with you, Michelle.
Yeah. All right. I'll talk to you later.
Okay, sure.
Bye-bye.